Well, okay. Hi everyone. Welcome to this quantitative history webinar this time. So today it's our great pleasure to have Professor Richard van Glahn from UCLA this time to deliver his research on his latest research on the Chinese history in paper and money history in Song time. So before we start, let me just briefly introduce him to the audience online here. So Professor Richard van Glahn is a distinguished professor in history at UCLA, and his research interests cover a wide range of topics, including social, economic, and cultural history of China, popular religion, urban history, popular social movements, comparative economic history, and global economic history, integration from roughly the Middle Ages to 1800s. And well, as many of you probably have already familiar with his work, he really has a long list of publications, and some of his far-reaching influential work include The Fountain of Fortune, Money and Monetary Policy in China, and the economic history of China from antiquity to the 19th century. And Richard has also been the co-author of the book World in the Making, A Global History, and he's also the co-editor of the latest, the Canberra Economic History of China. So today, joining us together are also Professor Jiu Chen from University of Hong Kong, and he's also the director of the Center for Quantitative History and the director of the Hong Kong Institute for Humanity and Social Sciences. And also today we have Professor Debbie Ma from the University of Oxford, who is also a leading expert in Chinese economic history. Yeah, here's Debbie. And we also have our discussant, Professor William Guangling Liu from Lingnan University, who is an expert in some Chinese economic history, and also he will be discussing with Richard today later on. So the whole event, the whole talk will run probably in an hour long, and then in 15 minutes time, in about 15 minutes time, we will have the discussion between Richard and Guangling, and then for the rest of the time, we will do the Q&A session. So if you do have any questions, you can leave it in the chat box so we can see it and later on give it to Richard. Okay, so without further ado, Richard, I will just hand over the stage to you.
Thank you, Zhang. And let me see if the share screen is going to work. So I trust you can see that now. So you can see the PowerPoint. Okay. Well, thank you very much, Zhang, for the introduction. I want to thank Chenzhu and the Quantitative History Webinar for this opportunity to present a part of and a brief summary of the rather long book on paper money in Songyangming that I'm currently preparing. There's been a long lineage of scholarship going back to Japanese scholars in the 1920s that have regarded the bills issued by the Song state as the world's first viable paper currency. This paper money has been seen as a key feature in the rise of a market economy in the Song and in what Mark Elvin referred to as China's medieval economic revolution. And the innovation of creating paper money has been seen as stimulated by market demand for money that the state mints, despite their prodigious output of coin, failed to satisfy. However, since the 1990s, there have been revisionist challenges to this view. One of the first was Bao Weimin, who challenged the idea that these Song bills served as a fiduciary currency, emphasized that they were not adopted as a measure of value, arguing that they had an only limited role as a means of exchange, especially because they were issued in large denominations. Even more forcefully, and going beyond that, the Japanese scholar Miyazawa Tomoyuki rejected the whole premise that the Song was a market economy. In his view, long-distance trade during the Song was mostly organized by the state for its fiscal needs, especially to pay for the enormous military expenses given the confrontations with the steppe frontier polities. Miyazawa coined the term fiscal circulation as opposed to a market economy to describe the Song, and argued that these bills acted simply as deposit certificates and not as a fiduciary money. And some of these arguments have more recently been presented in a number of articles by Wang Shen in the last 4 or 5 years. My argument will return to the original thesis that Song bills were indeed a genuine market money, but I certainly would also emphasize that the bills were integrated into the fiscal operations of the state. I think one of the problems with this discussion has been that the dichotomy between market and state has been overdrawn in ways that obscure the interactive synergy between the two. First of all, to speak of the Song monetary system, as I'm sure most of you are familiar with, since early imperial times, the monetary system, the monetary standard, was based on state-issued bronze coins. You see some examples here from the Song dynasties. These, of course, were low-value coins. It took quite a few of them to serve as means of exchange for large transactions. But this bronze coin standard served as the money of account both in public and private domains. During the Song period, the mints reached the highest output of coin in imperial history, surpassing even that of the Qing dynasty in the 18th century. You can see the estimates for the accumulated output, and again, these are in millions of coins, so very substantial, 260 billion plus during the Northern Song period. And yet, despite this prodigious output, it was insufficient to meet the demand. And the demand for money came from many sources in the Song. The way in which the Song shifts from direct taxation of land to indirect taxation of commerce and consumption certainly exacerbated the demand for money as a means of payment, as well as the demand originating in private trade. Although the bronze coin served as the monetary standard, the Song monetary system was characterized by multiple currencies in concurrent circulation, to steal a phrase from Kuroda Akinobu. In addition to the bronze coin, silver performed certain very important functions that have not been fully appreciated. Silver, of course, was still uncoined and remain uncoined for the rest of Chinese imperial history. As most people, I'm sure, do know, silver does become the monetary standard in China from the 15th century onward, and imports of foreign silver in the late Ming period from the 16th century onward were crucial in the early formation of a global economy. But in the Song as well, we see growing importance of silver in the fiscal and monetary system. And then, of course, the specific topic I'm raising today, the paper monies. And I want to emphasize here, too, that there were multiple paper monies. There was never a single paper money current across the entirety of the Song territories. So instead, we have regional paper currencies. And they have an important role in state finance, to be sure, but I would argue that they are market monies as well. At the time of the founding of the Song in the mid-10th century, the Song inherited the regional monetary systems that existed during the Five Dynasties period of disunion, especially the iron and lead coins that circulated in the separate southern kingdoms. And the Song was never successful in creating a unified currency system. It continued a practice of regional currencies that emerges in the Five Dynasties and perpetuated under the Song. Sorry, I meant to show you the silver currencies, again, not coined, but circulating in these kinds of ingots during this period. So the bronze coin remained the monetary standard, the unit of count, but again, the problem with these base metal currencies is that they were had very low unit of value. Therefore, that was a handicap in trade, in interregional commerce. What you see here is a portion of the Qingming Shanghetu, and here the inset that you see at on the right side from this picture of these fellows who are carrying the strings of coins out of this tavern here, apparently the daily take, and loading them onto what I'm referring to here as an armored truck. It's not really armored, but it is serving to transport these very heavy and massive quantities of coins. So I have to interrupt myself, and I'll probably have to keep doing this because my office lights are on a motion detector. If I don't move around, then my lights will shut off. So let me do that. Sorry. So to overcome this problem of dealing with very bulky coins, not at all suitable for long-distance trade, already in the 8th century, during the Tang Dynasty, the newly developed printing technology was applied to making state-issued bills of exchange. This continues in the Song under the name bianqian, convenient cash, whereby merchants could deposit various kinds of wealth, gold, silver, coin, silk, in the provinces to be redeemed at the capital, or vice versa, to transport or transmit funds from the capital to the provinces. These were bills that were payable on site, transferable to third parties. And similar, although we don't know quite as much about the private sector, similar bills clearly were issued by private deposit banks as well. In the late 10th century, the Song government begins to issue these exchange certificates, jiaoyin, for fiscal purposes. These would be offered to merchants to deliver provisions to the frontier armies, and they would be given the jiaoyin certificate that could be redeemed in the regulated commodities like tea, most importantly at that time, salt, alum as well. This is just a schematic of how this operated. The blue circles are merchants, the green circles are government agencies of one sort or another. So the frontier merchants delivering supplies to the frontier camps would receive the jiaoyin bill of exchange, which they themselves would then exchange with the long-distance merchants who actually go to the capital and the interior provinces. And these merchants would then take the bills either to the Monopoly Bureau at the capital to get the salt and tea licenses to deal in those regulated trades, or they could take them to these private exchange bill shops in the capital and receive cash for them. So these were negotiable bills transferable to third parties, a kind of fiduciary paper. And again, the common use of these to fund the frontier armies in the Song period meant that Song merchants were very well acquainted with this kind of fiduciary paper. Now, paper money itself originates in Sichuan, which had a very dynamic, Chengdu, of course, the main capital commercial center of Sichuan, a region that had a very dynamic commercial economy, supplying silk, paper, books to national markets, supplying tea to international markets, especially up to the Xia and Liao and other Central Asian groups as well. Sichuan was an old iron currency zone from the Five Dynasties period and remained an iron currency zone under the Song as well. And again, the iron currency was even lower in unit value and more bulky as an instrument of trade. It also meant that because this was the only iron coin region in the empire, the Sichuan merchants who went to the northwest, as I show here, or to the capital at Kaifeng, had no common currency with those regions. So the interregional trade between these regions, Sichuan and the rest of the empire, really was conducted in silver. It is in the Sichuan region in the 990s that Jiaozi bills are introduced as private bills of exchange, that is, say, issued by private agencies to compensate again for the limitations of the iron currency as a means of large-scale transactions or regional trade. With mixed results, many of the issuers defaulted. In the year 1005, the government steps in to regulate the issuance of these bills, designates a consortium of 16 merchant houses that were allowed to issue the bills, and then establishes standardized formats, size, colors, etc., for the bills. The actual value of the bill was determined individually. It's just written onto the bill by hand. So there were no standard denominations at this point. But even this effort to control the issue of the bills didn't work out very well. By 1020, there were many defaults by these issuers that prompted the regional government to prohibit the issue of any new bills. But this draconian action to simply prohibit Jiaozi bills had very disruptive effects on regional commerce and resulted in much pressure on the part of merchants to restore them. So in 1023, the prefect of Chengdu presents a memorial to the throne saying that the Jiaozi bills would be viable if their quantity was controlled and if they were convertible with coin. The court was persuaded and then initiated a state takeover of the Jiaozi currency. And it's at this point that the Jiaozi becomes paper money, I would argue. now issued in standardized but still quite large denominations, 1 to 10 guan. They begin to issue some smaller ones a few years later with a fixed quota and also a 2-year term of expiry, meaning that the bill had to be turned into the government after 2 years, and then a new bill could be received. So the fixed quota per issue means for a 2-year period, these bills would circulate. And again, a coin reserve was established so that the bills could be exchanged for cash as well. But almost immediately, the Jiaozi bills were linked to frontier defense, again, especially dealing with the armies up here along the Xia frontier, and Sichuan was the main supplier of those armies. So before 1026, version of the schematic that you saw before, the Sichuan merchants delivering supplies to the frontiers would receive a Jiaoyin bill, change that for silver before returning to Sichuan. After 1026, they would actually take the Jiaoyin bill back to Sichuan, where they could go to the currency bureau and exchange it for either Jiaozi bills or the iron coin. In the 1040s, a major war breaks out with the Xia. And so in addition to this process, the Sichuan Jiaozi Currency Bureau begins to deliver the Jiaozi bills directly to the frontier regions in the Northwest. And then they begin to circulate in those regions as part of local trade. And we can see this process whereby the bills are becoming more and more a market money in the way in which they are now used locally, not just in Sichuan, but in the Northwest. In 1068, the government changes the denominations of the bills, essentially shrinks the denominations by 90%. So 1 guan and 500 wen bills instead of the 10 or 5 guan bills in the past. And again, I think this is an indication of the way in which they're increasingly being used for market exchange and not simply as a means of long distance remittance. So the Jiaozi bills were integrally linked to military procurement for the Song state, but they are also functioning as market money. In the late 11th century, war with the Xia breaks out again, another massive military mobilization, soaring government expenditures that resulted in a massive increase in the issue of Jiaozi that had the consequence of drastically reducing their market value. So much so that in 1111, the government decides to dispense with the old Jiaozi bills altogether, replace them with a new bill known as Tianyin at a 4-to-1 exchange rate. So you have to bring 4 guan of old Jiaozi to get 1 guan of the new Tianyin. So for those who are holding the Jiaozi, you got 25 cents on your dollar. Obviously, they're the ones who suffered the loss there. Whereas for the government's part, this was a massive erasure of the government debt. These new Tianyin bills were no longer convertible with coin, and yet they seem to have had considerable success in being accepted in the marketplace. In 1127, the North China is overrun by the new steppe invaders, the Jurchen Jin dynasty. Of course, this inaugurates the southern Song period. In order to cope with these military expenditures, as you see here, you have a massive increase in the quantity of tianyin that are issued to 80 million by the turn of the 13th century. But what is quite striking is that despite this massive increase in the quantity of tianyin, their market values remained pretty stabilized. And in fact, iron coin almost completely ceases in Sichuan by this period of time. It's been estimated that tianyin constituted 98% of the region's money supply. So obviously very much a market currency. And we see that also in the way in which the tianyin become the measure of value. So prices, taxes are calculated in tianyin, market prices are expressed in tianyin as well. And again, considerable stability, despite the massive increase, considerable stability in the value of these bills. In the Southern Song period, with the confrontation between the Jin now occupying the north and the Song in the south, we see the emergence of distinctive regional monetary circuits that are defined both by a separate paper currency and a particular metallic currency, either bronze or iron, that is linked to it. Have to wave at my light once again. I'll be right back. So and this especially develops in the 1160s as an outbreak. There was a truce with the Beijing in 1141 that stabilized the frontier along the pink line that you see here. War breaks out again in 1161, which prompts the issue of a new paper currency known as huizi in the southeastern regions, Roman numeral 1 here. Of course, you have the tianyin currency, unique to Sichuan in the west. And then in the 1160s and after, you also have regional paper currencies introduced along the frontier regions with the Jin, the Huaijiao here, and the Huhui in central China. Now, when the huizi bills were first issued in 1161 to deal with the military emergency, the outbreak of war, a renewed war with the Jin, they were intended as a wartime exigency. And the emperor at the time, Xiaozong himself, very unhappy with having to resort to this expediency, decided in 1167, after the truce was reestablished, to withdraw the huizi bills from circulation. And to do so, he authorized the Ministry of Revenue to dispense a large quantity of silver, 37,000 kilograms of silver, to buy back these notes and remove them from circulation. But in doing so, by offering silver for the bills, these really boosted the merchant confidence in the bills. And so the merchants, rather than surrendering their bills, decide to say, oh, no, we will keep them. We're perfectly happy using this currency, which they preferred, certainly over the bronze coin. And so then the government decides to make the huizi permanent, beginning in 1170, in this case having a 3-year term of expiry rather than the 2-year, as was true in the Sichuan case. And the huizi were then integrated into the fiscal system of the Southern Song as part of a tripartite system of fiscal payments with coin and silver. So, for example, in 1172, the government issues orders that the soldiers' salaries are to be paid 20% in coin, 30% in silver, and 50% in huizi. And we actually have data on the average expenditures in the 1170s, 80s for the military. The cash portion is a little confusing because we don't know how much of that is bronze coin, how much of it is huizi, but most likely it was mostly huizi. So the coin portion probably maybe maybe 15% of the total, whereas 1/3 was being paid in huizi, but also 1/3 paid in silver. Again, we don't often appreciate how significant silver was as a fiscal instrument in the Song period. Other kinds of fiscal institutions, the sale of salt licenses, government purchases of grain on the marketplace, also use these same kinds of ratios, often 50% huizi, 50% coin, as ways of introducing huizi to the market and then having them return to the state in the payments that are made for commodity licenses and the payments for direct taxes. So this system is based again on multiple currencies that are used simultaneously for these kinds of state payments. But implicitly, the huizi were backed by silver. And when the market value of the huizi began to falter, the government would then buy some back using silver. That would further inspire confidence in the paper currencies and keep up their value. And this system works pretty well down to the turn of the 13th century. So you can't actually exchange huizi for silver, but there's an implicit backing of the bills by silver. So in the first decade of the 13th century, we have renewed war with Jin in 1206 and a sharp increase in the quantity of huizi issued. We do have data for most of the issues of huizi in the Southern Song period. As you can see, quite stable through the second half of the 12th century, but things around 1204 and especially 1211, the quantities in circulation are vastly increased. By 1211, there's 10 times as many bills in circulation by value as the 1180s. So the Song, again, faced with desperate financial straits, the war with the Jin and the presence of the Mongols now, abandoned its fiscal prudence, canceled the terms of expiry, beginning with issues 14 and 15 in 1211. They were eventually redeemed, but initially they had no terms of expiry. Even so, after the military emergency of the 12 teens, the monetary system stabilizes in the 1220s until a new crisis, a new shock appears in the early 1230s, which is the first Mongol invasions of Song territories. And so as you see here in 1234, especially, they begin to issue a new huizi bill that vastly increases the quantity in circulation. They try to redeem some of the old bills from 1211, retiring them by trying to use this, again, proven formula of issuing silver to exchange with the current paper currency in circulation. And again, you can see from this table that in this effort, it was overwhelmingly silver, to some extent gold, hardly any bronze coin being used for this purpose. But the problem here was that by this time, the government stocks of silver and gold were just far too small, given the quantity of circulation of the paper bills in circulation. So this effort to retire the old bills with hard currency failed to arrest the depreciation of the new bills, and they continue. This is when we have the real monetary crisis of the Song that persists until the final demise of the Song in the 1270s. And yet, even though we see this steady depreciation in the value of the Huizi bills across the 13th century, at this same time, we also find a transition to a paper money standard. To use the examples of the legal cases in the case book, the Qimingji, which involve legal disputes from the 1220s to the 1250s, land sales, the loans, estates and inheritances, even in betrothal gifts, we see that Huizi have really taken over as the basis, the monetary standard for these kinds of transactions. So we don't have very many land contracts from the Song, only 7, and relatively late, but they all specify payment in Huizi. Plenty of loans, land sales that specify payment in Huizi as well. Betrothal gifts, again, we have in Hangzhou, it became the custom that it must include both silver and Huizi in these kinds of payments. So there's other evidence beyond these legal cases to support the way in which Huizi really does become the monetary standard in the Southern Song, despite its drastic depreciation. And so indeed, the paper bills have become the standard, the monetary standard and the market money of the Song Empire. Now, again, returning to Miyazawa's critique, his argument that the Song bills were creatures of the state, issued to defray the costs of war, to facilitate military logistics, but not serving as a fiduciary currency. Among his arguments are that the denominations were too large for retail trade, therefore could not serve as a means of market exchange, that the terms of expiry, the requirement that you turn in these bills every 2 or 3 years, precluded their use as a store of value. And in his view, the demand for these bills was derived not from market exchange, but rather the direct or indirect coercion of the state through tax payments. And again, these are arguments that have recently been echoed in the work by Wang Shen. My response is, again, that the dichotomy between state and market here is overdrawn. On both sides, state and market, we have multiple actors and interests that often diverged among each other. The tea merchants, salt merchants, grain merchants all had very different vested interests in this system, as was true with the various levels of the Song government, from the central state to regions and localities. So we should not simply think of state and market as two monolithic blocks. And I want to emphasize what I've argued in other work on the fiscal state in Chinese imperial history, that the Song is best characterized as a synergistic fiscal state in which the government acquiesced to the autonomy of the market, sought to harness rather than subvert market forces. The Wang Ansher episode I'm leaving aside here for the moment, but this was generally true for Song fiscal policy. The government had cooperative as well as adversarial relationships with merchants. They had both, to be sure, depending on the circumstances, the issue at hand. But we also see that monetary and fiscal policies were often the product of negotiation and compromise with merchant groups. And throughout the Song period, the government is, whenever dealing with some fiscal problem, particularly things having to do with the monopolies, the salt monopoly, the tea monopoly, those kinds of things, they actually convene committees composed of both officials and merchants to address the, again, separate interests of those groups. And it's in this sense that I'm suggesting that the Song operated a synergistic fiscal system. And of course, we should also keep in mind that the state fiscal instruments take on a life of their own. Again, once more, I have to go keep my lights on. The Jiaoyin salt licenses, which I haven't really talked about, were created to provision the armies, but they also become negotiable instruments in secondary financial markets. And so they're used well beyond the purpose for which they are created. And these kinds of fiscal instruments, as well as the paper monies themselves, were subject to market discipline as the depreciation of these bills, or appreciation, depending on the circumstances, shows. Their market value very much rises and falls according to the market confidence in their value. And I would argue that is the value of the bills in the private market that sustained their utility in state finances. By the 12th century, all of these paper currencies are inconvertible. They are fiat currencies. And yet they also expand into market trade, become the money of account in commercial transactions. On the issue of the store of value function that Miyazawa raises, in my view, the terms of expiry did not affect the utility of paper currency as store of value. Miyazawa himself admits that the Tianyin currencies by the early 12th century had become, in fact, the market money of Sichuan, yet they still had terms of expiry. That never changed. And there is much evidence from Southern Song writers about the use of paper money as a store of value. And I'll just draw attention to one particular episode in 1215, when the government issues new paper bills, replaces the old again at a very unfavorable exchange rate for those who hold these bills. You've got one of the new bills for two of the old. We have descriptions of the great families of Hangzhou piling their huizi in the street and setting them ablaze to protest against this unfavorable exchange rate, which I see as very riveting testimony to the way, in fact, these bills were being held as stores of value. So my view then is that paper money and negotiable bills in general were integrated into the government's fiscal operations in the Song. Indeed, this is a very distinctive feature of the Song fiscal state, very different from what we see in the European case, for example. But the public confidence in the state's commitment and capability to honor these bills reduced financial risks and transaction costs. The fiscal crises of the 13th century that led to overissue and depreciation of the bills still did not cause their collapse, at least not before the really large Mongol invasions begin in the 1250s. Most of the time, the Song state maintained equilibrium in supply and demand for the paper money that enhanced use of bills as market money for diverse constituencies, as well as serving for the state's own fiscal needs. So I'm going to conclude here and turn things over to Glahn and for his response.
Okay, Richard, thank you very much. So now we were just doing a discussion session, and we will now have William Guanglin Liu to talk about his response and some of his ideas on Richard's presentation today. So Guanglin, now is the time. I will just hand it over to you.
Yes. Thank you, Richard, for providing me the chance. It's a great opportunity for me to learn again from Professor Richard Van Glahn. Richard was my teacher many years ago, even when I was a graduate student at Harvard. Actually, I was the first student in this field to propose the concept of military fiscal state in my PhD thesis. And I'm very happy to see Richard as, to endorse this idea. Certainly, he developed into a synergistic fiscal state. To money, in general, I highly appreciate and agree with Richard's explanation, his whole narrative about the innovation, the fiscal development in Song China, which take a balanced view between the role of the state and the active participation of the private sectors at the marketplace. I appreciate this perception. I fully agree. And Richard also made a very sharp point, like he mentioned the Song court field, or probably at the very beginning never have the ambition to achieve an integrated national standard of the money. So it's multiple standard. In a way, it's a state term allow the state intervention and also allow the autonomy of the market forces. It's a really exciting example. In pre-modern China, we see both the state and the private sectors played an active role at the same time. In many cases, we see it's different in other dynasties. Either the state take a decisive role which exclude the private sector, or the state full retreat from the marketplace, like what happened to the later Ming and even many periods of Qing dynasty. It's private merchant who manage, who handle the operation and the needs of the money supply at the economy. So I agree with all these important concept and idea. But also I have a question for Professor Richard van Glahn and many his colleagues in North America who study the economy and the finance of the zone density. The basic argument, the central idea is, one answer. The failure of the one's reform and the impact of the failure of the reform on the zone state in particular and on Chinese density in the long run. But focusing on today, Richard's lecture, if I'm correct, he mentioned a little about ones, which is quite different. So in the these other studies, even including Richard's preceding ones, where is ones? How did ones play the role in this scenario of the fiscal innovation? Was one's reform important? So that's I hope Richard could explain a little bit. And my second question is, Richard used this word, paper money. There's a different way we talk about, so it's shared a lot, but still the different terms. We talk about this soon fiscal innovation, 交子, 钱银, and 汇子. In other terms, such as commercial bills. It's slightly different, but still the difference is significant in a way. We basically address it's based on the function and the development of these bills were based on commercial bills. It's not really entirely fully recognized, this national money. It's rather its circulation was based on its value, its market value, its endorsement, and even as Richard put it in one of his slides, it's a negotiable instrument or negotiable bills. I want to ask Richard, in his mind, what's the difference between the paper bills or commercial bills issued by the Samsung government and the counterpart issued by the Yuan and the early Ming by nature, and their relationship with the market? What caused the difference? So that's my two questions. I would go one step further in a way. I think Richard's study is a very comprehensive one. As he mentioned, this long history of the scholarship, which traces back to 1920 by Japanese scholar Professor Fiscal, including then later on the Peng Xinwei, and even up to today, he mentioned Bao Wei-min and his disciples, and so forth and so on, and the Japanese scholars, Tomoyuki, Miyazaki Tomoyuki. And I certainly agree with Richard's handling of these different views and ideas. But the one thing I feel, the way Richard's study is a comprehensive one in traditional terms. He used to, like his many colleagues in North America, to explain, the zone status capacity or success or failure is a kind of a cycle of uphill and downward of the result of the state economic policy with regarding to the orientation or reorientation or changes in the orientation of the Confucian intellectuals. In other ways, it seems to trace the final cause to an intellectual history, the Confucian state or Confucian bureaucracy. I think that's a mainstream, even today. I mean, there's a long history of this mainstream paradigm. But I would remember our audience that in the last more than 1 decade, there's a new trend in the Chinese scholar, especially in the study of the yuan dynasty and the Ming dynasty, who try to break up with this, the overall bureaucratic Confucian state paradigm, to use the cycle to explain the come and up and down of the so-called bureaucratic state or mercantile state or fiscal state. They want to look for a very specific, very unique reason, even from external factors like the nomadic conquest, the yuan dynasty example. And they found, in a way, the Mongol ruling elite take no example, have nothing in designing their own yuan financial state, their yuan paper bills. They take no example, they take no consideration from either Jin or San Shu. They design follow, by their own local experience. In this way, we see the kind of discontinuity in terms of explaining this development or change in fiscal development in either in both state capacity and the fiscal market in later imperial China. And they certainly take the demonetization of the warfare in the Mongol as a crucial factor. So I also want to see how Professor Richard Glahn is comment or suggesting on this perspective. Yeah, that's what I have to say. I thank Richard again. Thanks for this opportunity.
So Richard, you are muted.
Thank you very much, Glahn, for both your support and for your questions. As you noted, Wang Ansher doesn't appear in this particular story. Of course, a very important episode in Song fiscal history, but to my view, a real deviation from the synergistic model. And of course, what we see with Wang Ansher is a way in which the state is rather than engaging in synergistic fashion with the merchants, instead wants to displace the merchants altogether and have state operatives take their place. So Wang Ansher doesn't fit into my model of a synergistic fiscal state whatsoever. As it happens, his regime is not very significant in the trajectory that I've outlined in terms of the development of the paper currencies. Of course, the Jiaozi was the only paper currency in existence during his period, and is largely unaffected by his other policies. It doesn't really have much of an effect there. So Wang Ansher, of course, extremely important to understand the fiscal history of the Song. I personally don't think of him as you say, many North American scholars consider him a failure. I actually don't agree with that, and I have a much more balanced view, I would say, of successes and failures of the Wang Ansher regime. In terms of the differences between the paper money, what I'm calling paper money, and the negotiable bills, it really has to do with how universally they can be used. Paper money, to my mind, means that they're an all-purpose money that is acceptable in any kind of market transaction. The negotiable bills have much more restricted range, and their final use in terms of acquiring, say, salt or tea or alum, various kind of regulated goods. Those bills, even if they're being traded in the secondary markets as assets, but they can't really be used in standard market transactions. So that's the distinction I'm trying to draw there. I didn't mention Yuan, sure, but I certainly didn't mention the Confucian intellectuals either. And they're not really part of my story, I'd have to say. And of course, I do read what they have to say about the paper money system. Certainly in the Southern Song, they're overwhelmingly critical. I mean, of course, it's really the Daoxue people who get to speak on this issue. Their works have been, their Wenji have been preserved, so they have a lot to say, a lot of criticisms to make of the paper monies in circulation. But I never take what they say at face value. Quite the opposite. I'm very distrustful of what they have to say. So by no means do I follow their guidance in trying to really evaluate the success or failure of the paper currencies. And of course, my story is essentially one of success. I mean, until the Mongols, the full-on Mongol invasion in the 1250s, I think the paper currency system is working. And I also think about the Mongol paper currency system as a success. I mean, it has its ups and downs, its problems, but until the massive outbreak of domestic rebellion in the 1230s, 1240s, up to that point, the system actually works pretty well. And of course, it's much more comprehensive as a market money because the yuan issue bills in much smaller units that you can use for daily purchases and the like. So my story is definitely a very positive one and very much in contrast to the Confucian intellectuals and certainly the Daoxue people. And in terms of thinking about the Chinese state, I'm very much inspired by the book that came out just last year by Charles Hartman, Structure of Governance in Song China. And Charles very much is based his study on the Chinese scholarship that you're referring to. His analysis is coming out of this recent turn in the last couple decades on the appreciation of the Song state as something very separate from the Confucian intellectuals, or for that matter, the scholar officials. And so he really emphasizes parts of the state that almost never appear in the standard narratives. The court itself, including the eunuchs, the palace women. He gives particular importance to the way in which the palace women, not just the empresses, but there's a whole bureaucracy of women in the palaces who are very much involved in the daily work of the imperial institution. The eunuchs, of course, an important role there. The military has a very separate unit, separate from the civil bureaucracy, and even merchants. He brings all of these into what he calls the structure of the Song state. And I think that's really the right way to go and to get away from what has been a traditional bias toward taking the Confucian intellectuals at face value and really focusing exclusively on the civil officials rather than the much more comprehensive and at times much more influential parts of a state institution. Does that answer all of your questions? I'm not sure if I...
Yes, yeah. Richard, thank you for your this explanation and clarification. It's very, very important. Yeah, very important.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thanks for the fascinating discussions here. So now we will likely have like 25 minutes reserving for the Q&A session. So if our audience from online have any questions, you can leave them in the chat. Okay, so I do have one from George Chiao. Well, I would just read it out, or Richard, you can. I think you can also see it in the Q&A part. So thank you for this wonderful talk. My first question is, what are the explanations for Jiaozi or Qianyin's continued popularity despite the significant inflations? What are the social and economic consequences of state-induced inflations? And finally, why was the Song able to manage the paper currency system successfully while the Ming failed spectacularly?
Well, a good set of questions. I'm not sure I have fully satisfying answers for them. I think in the case of the Sichuan currencies, Jiaozi and Qianyin, is that the obvious virtues of the paper currency over the whoops, the question has disappeared.
Oh, sorry.
Can I get it back?
Yeah, I think if we open that Q&A and then go to answered, so there were 3 sections: open, answered, and dismissed.
Okay, yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
So I think it's just, the vast disparity in the utility of the iron coin versus the paper currency explains why, despite the massive quantities introduced, and again, the inflation itself has the virtue of bringing the value of the denomination of the money more in line with the market prices. So inflation actually enhances the value of the paper currency in a sense that the denomination more closely corresponds to market prices. But I think Sichuan is a special case because of the iron currency region. The terms of state-induced inflations, again, it's not so much that prices inflate, but the paper currency depreciates. Prices are actually pretty stable for much of the Song period. Of course, there's an enormous burst of inflation at the time of the Jin conquest, and another one from the 1240s onward, when the Mongol invasions really began to have dramatic impact. But the general picture in price history in the Song is of moderate inflation, relatively stable prices, and the real question is the depreciation of the paper currencies. But this too, I think, has been overemphasized. And what happens with the depreciations is it brings the paper currencies in line with the market valuation of them, but that leads, I think, to a relatively stable result. Why was the Song able? Well, of course, the Song, as I suggest, is trying to manage a market economy. They're engaged with merchants. They're far more well-informed about the merchant side of all of these issues. And so I do think they do, and I would say this is true of the yuan as well. Again, they're more in tune with the realities of the marketplace and seeking to manage the various different kinds of claims that are placed on the monetary system. This is certainly not true of Zhu Yuanzhang and the early Ming. And he's trying to create a fiat currency that is vastly overissued, and again, as you say, failed spectacularly.
Okay, I think I have another question from Devin. Devin, are you there?
Yeah. Okay. Well, I do think there's a good question from. I'll be very quick. So, Richard, you said very quickly that the Song fiscal state was somewhat different from the European one. Could you just say briefly about that? What do you think is the major differences and so on? Very much.
Well, I mean, here I was thinking very specifically of the question of integrating paper money, negotiable bills in general into the government's fiscal operations. And of course, there are all kinds of bills, private bills in the European case, but they're not incorporated into the fiscal system of the state itself, at least not until the 18th century in Britain.
Okay, so here's another question from Xinhao Li. Again, it's in the Q&A part. Thank you for sharing, Professor. It reminds me of the fact that the early Ming government also used to encourage merchants to transport grains to the northern frontier through rewards given in the form of salt license. I will just wait for Richard to come back.
I hear you. I hear you.
Okay. This leads me to my question: why didn't paper money evolve successfully during the Ming Dynasty? What's the relationship between the military and money policies comparing Song with Ming?
Yeah, well, the Ming system of supplying the frontier armies is essentially based on the Song precedent. They have slightly different names for the system, but it's more or less the same kind of operation. But it doesn't work very well in my estimation. And of course, the Ming runs into a problem that the Song constantly runs into, which is that they issue more bills than they actually have salt. And so the holders of the bills wind up having to hold on to them for years or even decades before they can actually claim them. And so a secondary market in these bills emerges precisely because people don't want to hold onto them for years and decades. So that particular operation of the salt licenses is pretty similar in both cases. It fails eventually in the Ming period, and they dispense with the system altogether and go to an entirely different operation of essentially a franchise system in which only a designated set of merchants are allowed to get these licenses for salt distribution. Anyway, that's a slightly different story. But the paper money fails early on and spectacularly, as George said, only a few years after it's issued. And this left the Ming an enormous dilemma because it also stops minting bronze coin. Under the first emperor, a certain quantity is minted, not particularly large, certainly by Song standards. But from Yongle onward, they essentially shut down the mints. There's an 80-year period in the 15th century where the mints are closed altogether because it's too expensive for the Ming state to mint new coin. There's of course plenty of Song coin still in circulation. That's the main money supply, but there's no injection of new bronze currencies. And so by default, silver becomes first the market money and then the fiscal money of the Song state, of the Ming state, and gradually the Ming from the 1420s onward begins to incorporate the silver more and more into its fiscal system. But the bad experience with paper currency really affected the thinking of Ming statesmen about paper currency, and they never wanted to return to that whatsoever.
Richard, just a quick follow-up question. So I remember there was a very popular thesis among this monetary history in China that one of the reasons why the Ming Dynasty failed to stabilize these paper currencies because during the Yuan Dynasty, a lot of these precious metals like silver and gold were all transported into the Central Asia, so that to a certain extent caused this failure of the paper currency in the meantime. But I was wondering during the Song period, how this backup system works, like regarding the local currencies and these paper money currencies, do they work too well? I mean, when people trying to exchange paper currencies with other precious metals like silver and gold, do they work too well during some time?
Well, it's an interesting question because I'm not sure that I see much evidence of exchanging paper currencies with silver and gold as a kind of a regular financial transaction. What I was emphasizing was the way in which, again, initially silver was dispersed as a way of removing the paper currency from the market altogether. And as it turned out that given that the willingness of the state to do that, and it does do that a number of times over the late 12th century, the merchants decide, well, this money is actually worth something, even though you can't directly exchange it for silver. When the value goes down, the state has shown that it is willing to step in and disperse silver in order to bring the value back up. By the 13th century, the volume of paper currency is just vastly greater than that sort of implicit promise to redeem the paper money with silver. But on the point of the yuan, the export of silver from the Mongol Empire and Chinese territories to the West happens very early on. And again, we fail to appreciate how much silver there was in China, domestically mined, in the Song period. But massive quantities of silver, as you say, were exported to the West early in the 13th, so very early in the Yuan period, and really in the reign of Kublai, and also very early in the Yuan in terms of its paper money system in 1287. They turned the paper money into pure fiat currency, so it's no longer exchangeable with hard currencies of any sort. So the yuan paper currency is a pure fiat currency from 1287. It has its problems. It certainly depreciates, but it also, in I would say, a relatively stable way. So that down to at least the 1330s, the paper money system works pretty well.
Thank you. So I think this is a rather a comment from Vivian Forbes. Thank you for an interesting narrative on a historic narrative on paper money. It is ironic that in 2024, paper money is now looked down upon in China, Australia, and possibly USA, and plastic and EU money is the fashion. I think that's rather a comment.
Yeah, well, I'm sure we've all had the experience of trying to use paper money in China these days, and people turn up their noses at it.
Okay, I have two more questions. So one from Rose. It makes sense that people who invented paper would create a new market for their product use. Printing state paper money starts the expiration meter running on the bills. Is there any evidence that newer paper money became more valuable than older near expiration bills? I see similar characteristics to a future market or similarities to today's gift card that expire if not used within a specific time period.
Yeah, it's definitely true that the value of the old currencies really begins to fall when they're just about to issue a new one. So yeah, people are trying to get rid of old paper money in that situation before the new bills come on the market. We definitely see that kind of cycle happening over and over again.
Okay, so here's another question from George. How do you compare the some paper currencies with the widespread 钱票 or 商帖 of the Qing period? Obviously, the Qing state did not incorporate the 钱票 into its fiscal operation, but would you see the 钱票 as a continuation of the paper currency tradition of the Song Yuanming?
Well, it's a continuation not of what I'm talking about. I mean, there are plenty of local private currencies like the qianpiao, yinpiao, etc., in the Qing period that are issued by private agencies and generally have a pretty restricted range of circulation because their value is really dependent on the reputation of the issuer. And if you don't know who the issuer is, then they have no value. So those are very localized forms of paper currencies. And we do have those in the Song as well. And there's certainly plenty of evidence that such things were created. What I find interesting, and haven't quite been able to answer the question of how these private currencies competed with the state issued currencies. So of course, what's different from the ones that George is talking about in the Qing is they're not state issued. And so they're not valid, especially in payment of taxes, which again is one of the major supports of the Song paper money. The way they incorporate it into the required tax payments obviously means that people need this paper currency in order to pay their taxes, and they will get a standard value from the tax collector when they do so. It is very interesting when the huizi is introduced in the 1160s. Apparently, there is some competition with the private bills that have been issued by Hangzhou merchants. Again, they circulate in Hangzhou, not very far beyond that. But the government seemed to actually take measures to prevent, to suppress these private bills in order to establish their own state bills.
Okay, so for the last couple of minutes, I would like to invite Zhu to give some of his final thoughts on our talk today. And please be aware that Zhu is also our convener for the seminar series, so we would like to hear what he thinks about today's seminar.
Yeah, well, no, okay, thank you, Richard. So I have two quick follow-up or somewhat more general questions. One is, given that you have spent so much time doing research and writing on the history of paper money, and also, we see that the paper money has its origin in Sichuan or the Chengdu plains. Have you what is your general impression or understanding of why Sichuan was the place where this started in terms of paper money? Of course, there were many wars and so on, but across China at different times, there were wars in other parts as well. But somehow this happened in Sichuan, but not in other parts of China. That's the first one. The second question or observation is, I understand that you and other scholars in this area would like to use the framework of command economy versus market economy. I don't know to what extent, during the Song time or even the Tang time, it was really possible for the imperial government to really implement a command economy, so to speak, right? Because the transportation infrastructure was just so preliminary. It would have been physically impossible to really adopt a command and control system to control and regulate prices and the supply and demand of goods and so on. So I understand what I'm trying to say is that in more modern times, after the transportational technologies really took off, then having a command economy it would be more feasible and practically operationally doable. But in the old days, before the Industrial Revolution, even if the government had really wanted to do that, it would have been very hard to actually do. So that comparison between market economy and a command economy may not be as relevant for more ancient times. Yeah.
Well, first on the question of Sichuan, I think it's a combination of having a very low value monetary system based on iron coin, very bulky, not well adapted to market transactions at all on the one hand, with a very dynamic regional and interregional and international economy on the other. So the demand for market money that can serve the purposes of regional interregional trade was certainly strongest there compared to anyone else. As I said, what happened in the early Song is that silver becomes the medium in which the Sichuan merchants interact with the rest of China, which had the effect of making silver in Sichuan more expensive than anywhere else, right? And so the paper currency was definitely beneficial in providing them with a more efficient means of transaction. Well, of course, my own conception of a synergistic fiscal state in the Song rejects the dichotomy between command and market economies, and suggests that the state, at least in its fiscal policies, is very much trying to manage both the its fiscal operations but also respond to the market as well. Certainly, I can't see a command economy existing in any. There's no way that the state is going to control production, for example, in any basic way. Even in the Qin dynasty, as we can now see from the Tutu Wenxian, that it was never the kind of command economy that they may have imagined. So I think that was always out of the reach in a pre-modern economy.
Yeah, thank you very much, Richard. So this is a very interesting talk for you to share with us your work in this area. Yeah, thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate the invitation.
Yeah, okay, so we're just on time. And again, thank you, Richard, for this fascinating presentation. And also thanks all our panelists here. Thanks, Zhu, and thanks, Glahn, for their contributions. And also thanks everyone for joining us today. So tomorrow will be the eve of the Chinese New Year. So here, Beth just shared with us a nice looking picture here for the coming Lunar New Year. And I wish everyone a happy Chinese New Year tomorrow. And yes, thanks to everyone again, and hopefully we will see you everyone next time. Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, take care.